Before we dive into today's terrifying tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a spine-chilling story. Let's get into it. The story of Creepypasta.
I never thought my life would take such a dark turn. My name is Alex, and I grew up in a small town in the Midwest. Life here was mostly uneventful, the kind of place where everyone knows each other's names and secrets linger like fog on a chilly morning. But that all changed one fateful night. It was a Saturday, and my friends and I were feeling adventurous. We had heard rumors about an old, abandoned house on the outskirts of town. They said it was haunted, that strange things happened there. Most importantly, they said it was the last known place where a boy named Jeff had lived. I'd heard the story many times, how he had been bullied mercilessly, how he fought back, and how something horrific happened that turned him into a monster. The stories grew more exaggerated each time, but I couldn't resist the thrill of exploring the unknown. After convincing a couple of friends, Jake and Sarah, we decided to go check it out. As we approached the house, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch towards us like skeletal fingers. The air felt electric, heavy with anticipation and fear. The old wooden structure creaked under our weight, as if warning us to turn back. But we pressed on, laughter masking our unease. Inside, the air was stale, and the floors creaked beneath our feet. Dust motes danced in the fading light as we made our way through the debris. We found old furniture covered in sheets, peeling wallpaper, and broken glass scattered across the floor. It felt like we had stepped into a time capsule, a place frozen in anguish and despair. As we moved deeper into the house, we came across a room that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. On the walls were drawings, disturbing depictions of a faceless figure with elongated limbs. My heart raced as I recognized the unmistakable outline of the creature we had all heard about, the Slender Man. But what caught my attention more was a crude sketch of a boy with pale skin and wild hair, a twisted smile stretching across his face. I felt a chill run down my spine. Suddenly, we heard a noise, a soft shuffling sound coming from the hallway outside. Our laughter faded, replaced by a tense silence. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Jake and I nodded, our hearts pounding in our chests. We exchanged nervous glances, the thrill of exploration now replaced by an ominous feeling. We decided it was best to leave. As we turned to head back, the air grew heavy, and I felt as if something was watching us. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to thicken, closing in around us. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it clung to me like a shadow. Just as we reached the front door, I glanced back one last time. There, in the darkness of the hallway, stood a figure, a tall, thin silhouette with long arms. I couldn't make out its features, but the essence of dread washed over me. I turned and bolted out of the house, my heart racing. Jake and Sarah followed close behind, their breaths quick and panicked. As we stumbled into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being pursued. The laughter from earlier had turned into frantic whispers that echoed in my mind. Little did I know, that was just the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt me forever. The next few days were a blur. My mind kept racing back to that abandoned house, the sketches on the walls, and the chilling feeling that something sinister lurked within those shadows. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light or an overactive imagination fueled by too many horror stories. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Sleep became elusive. Each night, as I lay in bed, the memory of that figure haunted me. The face was a blur, but the feeling of dread was all too real. I started hearing whispers in the dark, words I couldn't quite make out. The sound would crawl into my ears like an unwelcome intruder, making it impossible to relax. It felt as if the shadows themselves were alive, creeping closer with each passing night. One evening, unable to bear the oppressive silence any longer, I decided to do some research on Jeff. I found a thread online dedicated to him, stories and sightings that sent shivers down my spine. Each account was more chilling than the last, detailing encounters with a grotesque figure that would invade homes at night. People described waking up to find Jeff standing at the foot of their beds, his pale face and dark eyes staring into their souls, a sinister smile plastered across his disfigured features. The thought made my skin crawl. That night, I dreamt of Jeff. He was standing in my room, just like the story said, his presence so overpowering that I could barely breathe. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, feeling like I had just escaped a nightmare. I convinced myself it was just a dream, but when I glanced at my clock, I realized it was 3 a.m., the witching hour, when all things dark and twisted seemed to come alive. I started noticing changes in my friends as well. Jake had become more withdrawn, his eyes dark circles beneath them. He talked about hearing things at night, claiming he saw shadows darting past his windows. Sarah, usually the bravest among us, began to flinch at the slightest noise. I tried to reassure them, telling them it was all in our heads, but I couldn't shake my own fear. One evening, I received a message from an unknown number. The text simply read, "I'm coming for you." A chill ran down my spine. I thought it was a prank, maybe one of my friends trying to scare me, but the next morning I found a photograph on my phone that made my blood run cold. It was a blurry image taken from outside my bedroom window. I could barely make out a figure lurking in the darkness, but I knew, without a doubt, it was Jeff. Panic set in. I told my friends about the message and the photo, but they brushed it off as a coincidence. "You're just imagining things, Alex," Jake said. But I could see the fear behind his eyes, and I knew he felt it too. The closer we got to Halloween, the more restless I became. The air was thick with tension, and whispers seemed to fill every corner of my home. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. Was Jeff truly a figment of my imagination, or was he real? The line between myth and reality began to blur, and I realized I was trapped in a nightmare with no escape. Each night, the whispers grew louder, urging me to embrace my fear, to accept that Jeff was more than just a story. I was beginning to believe that he was coming for me, and soon I would find out just how real he was. It was the night before Halloween, and the air felt electric with anticipation. The streets were filled with costumed kids laughing and shouting as they collected candy from the neighbors, but I couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. I spent the evening in my room, the curtains drawn tightly, as I tried to block out the sounds of celebration. All I could think about was Jeff. I was exhausted but too terrified to sleep. The nightmares had grown more vivid, each one more horrifying than the last. It felt as if Jeff was getting closer with each passing night, inching his way into my reality. I could almost hear him whispering to me, taunting me with promises of despair. Around midnight, I finally decided to call Jake and Sarah. I needed to talk to someone about this. They picked up after a few rings, their voices shaky. "Hey, are you okay?" Jake asked, concern threading through his tone. "I don't know, man. I just feel like something is coming." "It's been too quiet," I admitted, my voice trembling. Sarah chimed in, "I haven't been able to sleep either." I keep hearing noises outside my window. I thought it was just my imagination, but it's getting worse. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I wasn't alone in this. We should all stay together tonight. There's safety in numbers, right? I suggested. They agreed, and we planned to meet at my house. As I prepared for their arrival, I heard a faint tapping noise coming from my window. My heart raced as I moved closer, the darkness outside swallowing my view. I peered through the blinds but saw nothing. Maybe it was just the branches tapping against the glass. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. A short while later, Jake and Sarah arrived, both looking as pale as I felt. We settled into the living room, the lights dimmed low to ward off the shadows that seemed to stretch across the walls. We shared our experiences, and as we spoke, the air grew heavier, the room becoming a vessel of our fears. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the kitchen, shattering the fragile sense of safety we had built. We jumped up, eyes wide with terror. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know," I stammered, feeling the dread coil tighter around me. I grabbed a flashlight, my hands shaking as I turned it on. The beam flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room. We tiptoed towards the kitchen, the silence deafening. As we reached the doorway, I stopped dead in my tracks. The fridge door stood wide open, and everything inside was strewn across the floor. My heart raced as I scanned the room, looking for any sign of an intruder. Then I saw it. In the far corner, just beyond the beam of light, stood a figure, pale and gaunt, with eyes that glowed like embers in the dark. My breath caught in my throat. It was him. It was Jeff. "Run!" I screamed, adrenaline surging through me. We turned and bolted back into the living room, but the moment we crossed the threshold, the lights flickered and went out. Darkness enveloped us, the silence now an oppressive weight pressing down on my chest. Panic set in as I fumbled for my phone, its screen a small beacon of light in the suffocating blackness. I turned it on, illuminating the room just enough to see Jake and Sarah's terrified faces. "Where is he?" I gasped, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear their replies. "I don't know," Jake shouted, his voice filled with fear. The shadows shifted around us, and I felt a cold breeze brush past me, a whisper sliding through the air. "You shouldn't have come here," it hissed, sending a chill racing down my spine. I backed against the wall, my heart hammering in my chest as I fought to make sense of what was happening. My mind was racing, trying to piece together the fragments of fear and horror swirling around me. Suddenly, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. Jeff was there, closer than before, his disfigured face twisting into a macabre grin. My instincts kicked in, and I bolted towards the front door. "We need to get out." "No," I yelled. As we stumbled into the night, the darkness swallowed us whole. I could hear the echoes of laughter from the nearby houses, oblivious to the nightmare we were living. But as we ran, I felt Jeff's presence looming behind us, an insidious shadow that threatened to engulf us. That night marked the beginning of a descent into madness, where the line between reality and nightmare blurred, and Jeff the Killer became more than just a story. He was now a part of our lives, a horrifying reality we could no longer escape. The nights that followed were a blur of terror. I could hardly sleep, my body trembling at the thought of Jeff lurking just beyond the reach of my vision. Each time I closed my eyes, I felt his presence, cold, watching, waiting. My friends and I tried to go about our lives, but the horror of that night haunted us like a shadow that refused to leave. Jake and Sarah insisted we stay in touch, texting constantly. We formed a pact to never be alone, even if it meant spending our days in crowded public places. I kept my phone close, the light a flimsy barrier against the darkness that seemed to creep closer with each passing day. One afternoon, as I was scrolling through social media, I stumbled upon a thread about Jeff the Killer. My stomach churned at the familiar photos, the stories that turned my blood cold. People were sharing their own encounters, allegations of sightings, sinister encounters, and the all-too-familiar feeling of being watched. My heart raced as I read, each post pulling me deeper into a pit of dread. That evening, Jake suggested we all meet at his house to watch some movies, something to take our minds off things, he said. I reluctantly agreed, desperate for a distraction from my spiraling thoughts. We settled into Jake's living room, the flickering light of the television providing a false sense of security. Laughter filled the air as we tried to enjoy a horror movie, but the tension in the room was palpable. Halfway through, the film's sound suddenly cut out, replaced by a static that filled my ears with a piercing ring. My heart dropped as I felt the temperature drop in the room. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, fiddling with the remote. Before he could fix it, the lights flickered again, and in that moment of darkness, I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I turned to Sarah, who looked as terrified as I felt. "Did you feel that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Yeah, I did," she replied, her eyes wide. The lights came back on, and just then, a loud thud echoed from the hallway. Our laughter turned to silence, fear coating the air like a heavy fog. We exchanged panicked glances. "What was that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not sure," Jake said, slowly getting up. "Stay here. I'll check it out." "No. We should stick together." I protested, but he was already moving, disappearing down the darkened hallway. Moments later, Sarah and I heard another crash, this one louder and more insistent. My heart raced as I jumped to my feet. "Jake!" I shouted, but there was no answer. "Let's go," I urged, grabbing Sarah's hand. Together, we cautiously followed Jake's footsteps, fear pooling in the pit of my stomach. The hallway was shadowy and foreboding, stretching out like a gaping maw. When we reached the end of the hall, the door to Jake's room stood ajar, swinging slowly as if beckoning us to enter. "Jake!" I called out again, but my voice quivered, barely carrying into the room. Sarah and I exchanged terrified glances before stepping inside. The room was empty, but the air felt thick and charged, like a storm was brewing just beneath the surface. Then, I spotted something that made my blood run cold. Jake's phone lay on the floor, the screen cracked and glowing ominously. "Where is he?" I murmured, panic rising in my chest. Suddenly, the lights flickered once more, and the shadows in the room seemed to pulse with life. I turned to look at Sarah, but she was staring past me, her eyes wide with horror. I spun around just in time to see a pale figure standing in the corner, its face hidden in darkness. "Jeff!" I gasped, my breath hitching in my throat. Before I could react, the figure lunged toward me. I screamed, stumbling backward and crashing into Sarah. We scrambled to get away, but the creature was too fast. I could feel its icy breath on my neck as we raced for the door, adrenaline propelling us forward. We barreled out of the room and into the hallway, but the front door was suddenly blocked by shadows. I felt as if the very air was thickening around us, constricting our escape. The whispers began again, swirling in my mind, drowning out my thoughts. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice hissed, chilling me to the bone. "Run!" I shouted, and we pushed past the darkness, hearts racing as we burst through the back door into the night. The chill of the autumn air bit at our skin, but we didn't stop running. We didn't look back. All that mattered was getting away from that house, away from Jake, from Jeff, from whatever had come for us. As we stumbled into the nearby woods, my heart pounded against my ribcage, and I could hear Sarah gasping for breath beside me. What just happened?" she panted, her eyes wild with fear. "I don't know," I replied, still shaking. "But we can't go back." We pressed on, deeper into the woods, the trees looming overhead like ancient sentinels guarding the darkness. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed, that Jeff was right behind us, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The weight of our choices pressed heavily on me, and I knew that this was only the beginning. The nightmare was far from over. The night felt endless as Sarah and I stumbled through the dense underbrush, the darkness swallowing us whole. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves sent jolts of fear through me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see Jeff lurking just beyond the trees, his twisted grin waiting to claim us. "Do you think we lost him?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking as we paused to catch our breath. The moonlight filtered through the branches, illuminating her terrified face. I hope so," I said, trying to convince both of us. But a gnawing feeling in my gut told me that this wasn't over yet. We pressed on, moving deeper into the woods, desperate to find somewhere safe to hide. The chilling whispers had faded, but the memory of that horrifying figure loomed large in my mind. I could still see his pale face, the way it seemed to melt into the shadows. I could still hear the promises he had whispered, threats of despair that sent shivers down my spine. After what felt like hours, we stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin. The wooden structure stood crookedly, half hidden by overgrown vines and thick underbrush. It looked like something out of a nightmare, but it was better than being out in the open. "Should we go in?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my instincts screaming that we needed shelter. As we stepped inside, the door creaked ominously, echoing into the darkness. The air was stale, thick with the scent of decay. The cabin's interior was dimly lit by the moonlight filtering through broken windows, revealing dust-covered furniture and scattered debris. We huddled in a corner, trying to steady our breathing. I could feel Sarah's fear mingling with my own as we listened intently for any signs of Jeff. The cabin felt like a trap, but we had nowhere else to go. "What if he finds us?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. I didn't want to think about that. "We'll be okay," I lied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We'll just wait it out." Minutes stretched into hours as we sat in the cold, waiting for dawn to break. But as the hours passed, I could feel the weight of exhaustion creeping in. My eyelids grew heavy, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jeff's face staring back at me, eyes dark, grin wide. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the cabin, jolting us awake. I jumped to my feet, adrenaline surging through my veins. "What was that?" Sarah gasped, her eyes wide with terror. "I don't know, but we need to move," I said, grabbing her hand. We crept toward the door, our hearts pounding in our chests. Just as we reached the threshold, we heard a low, guttural laugh, one that sent chills racing down my spine. "There's nowhere to run," the voice echoed, impossibly close. Panic set in as we realized we were trapped. I turned back, looking for another way out, but it was too late. The shadows around us seemed to twist and shift, taking form as Jeff emerged from the darkness. His face was pale and grotesque, the smile etched across his disfigured features sending waves of nausea through me. "Welcome to my playground," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "Get away from us!" I screamed, instinctively pushing Sarah behind me. The primal urge to protect her surged through me, even as dread clawed at my insides. Jeff stepped forward, his movements fluid and unnerving. "You shouldn't have come here," he taunted, eyes gleaming with a sinister hunger. "You're all mine now." In that moment, something snapped inside me. Fear transformed into fury, and I charged at him, adrenaline fueling my every movement. "Leave us alone," I shouted, swinging at him. My fist connected with nothing but air, and he vanished into the shadows with a laugh. "Is that all you've got?" he mocked from the darkness, his voice echoing around us. "Sarah, we need to find a way out," I yelled, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward the back of the cabin. We rushed to a window, desperate to escape. But before we could reach it, Jeff reappeared, blocking our path with a sinister grin. The darkness surrounding him seemed to pulse, alive with menace. "You can't escape," he hissed, lunging toward us. In a split second, I spotted a rusted metal pipe on the ground. Without thinking, I picked it up and swung it wildly, hoping to catch him off guard. The pipe connected with a sickening thud, and for a moment he staggered back, surprise flashing in his eyes. "Run, Sarah!" I shouted, and we darted for the window. I helped her through, but just as I was about to follow, Jeff grabbed my ankle, his grip icy and unyielding. "Not so fast," he sneered, dragging me back into the darkness. I fought against his hold, thrashing and screaming, but it felt like I was trapped in a nightmare. Just as despair threatened to consume me, I remembered the stories, the legends of people who had faced him and lived to tell the tale. "Get away from her!" I screamed, channeling every ounce of rage and fear I felt. With a sudden surge of strength, I kicked out, my foot connecting with his chest. He let go, and I rolled free, scrambling through the window into the night. The moment I hit the ground, Sarah was there, pulling me up and away from the cabin. We ran into the woods, not daring to look back, fueled by sheer adrenaline and terror. As we stumbled through the trees, my heart raced, knowing that we had escaped for now. But the feeling of being hunted lingered in the air. The stories had warned us, but I had never believed they could be true. Now, as dawn broke over the horizon, I realized we had only just begun to scratch the surface of the horror that was Jeff the killer. He was out there, and I knew he would return. Our fight was far from over, and I could only hope we would be ready for the next encounter. The legend of Jeff was now intertwined with our lives, and there was no escaping that fact.
The story of the rake.
I never really believed in monsters. Growing up in a small town in Springfield, Massachusetts, I thought the worst things I'd ever face were school bullies or spiders in the garage. But that all changed when my family moved into an old, creaky house at the edge of town. From the moment I stepped inside, a chill crept up my spine. The air felt heavy, like it was saturated with secrets and shadows. As I unpacked my things in my new room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The walls were a sickly shade of green, and the floorboards groaned under my weight. My eyes were drawn to the closet, slightly ajar, casting a long shadow across the room. I tried to brush it off. Just an old house, I told myself. But that night, as I lay in bed, I felt an unease settle over me like a thick blanket. Every creak of the house echoed in the darkness, and I found myself holding my breath, straining to listen. I pulled the covers tightly around me, convinced that if I hid long enough, I could sleep. But then, I heard it, a faint scratching noise, barely audible at first but growing louder. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, eyes glued to the closet. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The silence that followed felt suffocating, almost mocking. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping that when I opened them again, it would all be gone. But the scratching continued, insistent and eerie, like something was trying to get in. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Adrenaline surged through me as I swung my legs over the side of the bed, forcing myself to stand. My heart hammered in my chest as I approached the closet, my breath quickening. I gripped the doorknob tightly, my palms slick with sweat. With a swift motion, I flung the door open. Nothing. Just clothes hanging limply in the dim light. I let out a shaky breath, almost laughing at myself for being so scared. But as I turned back to my bed, I felt a sudden chill wash over me. That night, I lay in bed, wide awake, the scratching sound still echoing in my mind. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. After all, it was an old house. But deep down, I felt it, the creeping dread that something was watching me, waiting for the darkness to consume me. The next day, I tried to push the terrifying experience out of my mind. After all, it was my first day at a new school, and I wanted to make a good impression. I got dressed, plastered a smile on my face, and headed out. My parents drove me to Springfield High, and while they were busy chattering about the neighborhood, I stared out the window, trying to shake off the lingering anxiety from the previous night. School was a blur of faces and voices. I met a few friendly classmates, and they introduced me to the usual high school rituals: finding lockers, navigating the cafeteria, and avoiding the dreaded gym class. But as I sat through my classes, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched, even in a crowded room. It was a strange, unsettling sensation, like I was the focus of someone's piercing gaze. When I returned home that afternoon, the house felt different. The atmosphere was heavier, almost suffocating. As I walked through the front door, the familiar creaks of the floorboards sent shivers down my spine. I dropped my backpack by the stairs and made my way to the kitchen, where my mom was preparing dinner. The sound of her chopping vegetables was a comforting normalcy amid my growing unease. But that night, everything changed. As the sun dipped below the horizon, shadows danced in the corners of my room, growing longer and more menacing. I tried to shake off the anxiety, but the memory of the scratching returned. I made sure to lock the door and pulled the curtains tight, hoping to create a cocoon of safety. But as darkness enveloped the house, a sense of dread settled over me. Lying in bed, I strained to listen, my heart racing as the scratching noise began again. This time, it was different. It was accompanied by soft whispers, indistinct but chilling. My mind raced. Was it just my imagination? The sound grew louder, more frantic, as if something was desperate to get my attention. "Help me," a voice seemed to plead, thin and trembling. I froze, terror gripping me. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The whispers stopped, leaving an eerie silence that swallowed the air. I lay still, heart pounding, waiting for a response. "Help me," came again, clearer this time, echoing in my mind as if it were coming from inside the walls. I felt paralyzed by fear, unable to move, unable to scream. Gathering every ounce of courage, I swung my legs over the side of the bed again, stepping into the chill of the floor. I crept toward the closet, drawn by the whispers. The door loomed in front of me, the shadows inside growing darker and more threatening. Just as I reached for the doorknob, A cold draft swept through the room, and I felt something brush against my arm. I jumped back, heart racing, and in that moment, I knew I wasn't alone. I stood there, paralyzed, my breath caught in my throat. The whispers escalated into frantic cries for help, and I realized it wasn't just my imagination. It was real, and it was getting closer. I stumbled back from the closet, my heart racing as I tried to convince myself that I was just dreaming. But the icy sensation on my arm and the desperate whispers continued to echo in my mind, forcing me to confront the reality that something was very wrong. With every passing second, the atmosphere thickened, and I could feel a weight pressing down on me, as if the house itself was alive, watching. I hesitated for what felt like an eternity, staring at the closet door, wondering if I was truly brave enough to face whatever lay within. The whispers became a low, keening sound, a haunting melody that seeped into my bones, urging me to come closer. Summoning every ounce of courage I could muster, I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling. As I pulled the door open, the darkness inside seemed to swallow the light from my room. My heart hammered in my chest, and I squinted into the inky blackness. The clothes hung still, but the air was electric with anticipation. Suddenly, something darted out from the shadows, a pale figure, emaciated and grotesque, its eyes wide and glistening in the dim light. I stumbled back, gasping, as I caught a glimpse of its elongated fingers and skeletal frame. It was the rake, just like the stories I had read online, just like the creature that haunted my nightmares. The thing stared at me, its face devoid of features except for a gaping mouth that twisted into a silent scream. I felt frozen, unable to scream or move, caught in its piercing gaze. The world around me faded away as I locked eyes with the creature, and I felt my sanity slipping. It lunged forward, and I instinctively slammed the closet door shut, collapsing against it as I tried to catch my breath. "Get away from me!" I screamed, my voice breaking the suffocating silence. I backed away from the closet, staring at the door as if it might burst open again at any moment. The whispers had turned into a cacophony of desperate cries, filling my mind with chaos. I could hear my own heartbeat, pounding in my ears like a war drum. In a panic, I darted across the room, throwing myself onto my bed, pulling the covers over my head as if they could shield me from the horror I had just witnessed. But the covers felt thin and fragile, offering little protection against the darkness that lurked just beyond the fabric. I pressed my eyes shut, trying to drown out the noise, hoping that when I opened them again, it would all be gone. But the cries persisted, growing louder, merging into a sinister chant that echoed through the room. My thoughts raced as I tried to make sense of what was happening. What did it want from me? Why was it here? I remembered the stories I had read. The rake was drawn to fear, to those who had witnessed its terrifying form. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had unwittingly invited it into my life, and now it wouldn't leave me alone. As I lay there, trapped in my own mind, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and I could see my breath misting in the air. I peeked from under the covers, and my heart dropped at what I saw. The closet door was ajar again, and from the darkness, the figure began to emerge, its body contorting in unnatural ways, inching closer to my bed. I was paralyzed with fear, knowing that this was only the beginning. The rake had come for me, and there was no escaping the nightmare I had awakened. I was sure I was dreaming, trapped in a waking nightmare. The figure continued to creep closer, its elongated limbs bending at unnatural angles, and its skeletal frame glimmering in the faint light. I had read about the rake's predatory nature, how it thrived on fear, but nothing could have prepared me for the terror I felt in that moment. I wanted to scream, to shout for my parents, but my voice was stuck in my throat, choked by sheer terror. The creature was inches from my bed now, its breath cold against my skin. It felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in sync with the whispers in my mind, as if they were orchestrating a symphony of horror designed to drive me to madness. Then, as if sensing my growing despair, it lunged forward, and I rolled off the bed, scrambling to my feet. I knew I had to get out of the room. I had to escape the malevolence that had invaded my sanctuary. But as I dashed for the door, the world around me distorted. It felt like I was moving in slow motion, the shadows creeping up the walls and clawing at my sanity. I burst through the door and sprinted down the hallway, desperately trying to reach my parents' room. But the house seemed to conspire against me. The hallway stretched endlessly, each step feeling like it took me farther from safety. The whispers followed, echoing in my mind, growing louder and more frantic. I could hear my name woven through their cries, a chilling reminder of my isolation. "Help me! Help me!" they screamed, but I didn't know if they were pleading for me or mocking me. I pressed on, tears streaming down my face as I raced toward my parents' room. I needed them, needed to feel safe, to break the suffocating grip of the darkness. As I reached their door, I slammed my shoulder against it, throwing it open. But the sight that met me was worse than I could have imagined. My parents were gone, the bed neatly made, and the room untouched. It was as if they had never been there. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I turned, ready to go back to my room, to confront the rake, but the hallway was dark, too dark. The shadows seemed to pulse, and I could hear the scratching sound again, crawling closer, as if the creature was testing the edges of reality. I felt a cold sweat trickle down my back, and I knew I was losing my grip on sanity. "Mom, Dad," I screamed, my voice hoarse and raw. The only response was the hollow silence of the house. It felt like a tomb, and I was its only inhabitant. I couldn't stay here. I had to get outside. I turned and sprinted down the stairs, desperate for the fresh air, for the light of the moon. Each step felt heavier, as if the house itself was pulling me back, trying to keep me in its suffocating embrace. I reached the front door and flung it open, bursting into the cool night air. But my relief was short-lived. As I stepped outside, the world was eerily still. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward me. I turned, looking back at the house, and there it was, the rake, standing in the doorway, its eyes glistening with hunger. I stumbled back, terror gripping my heart. It wasn't just in my head, it was real, and it had followed me into the night. The whispers intensified, merging into a single chilling chorus that echoed in my ears. Join us, they chanted, and I realized with horror that I was standing on the precipice of madness, teetering between the world of the living and the darkness that called to me. With every ounce of strength left, I turned and ran, not knowing where I was going, but knowing that I had to escape. The night swallowed me whole, and the chase began. The rake was behind me, its presence a dark shadow that loomed ever closer. And in that moment, I understood. I was trapped in a nightmare, and there was no way out. I ran through the night, my breath coming in frantic gasps as I tried to put as much distance as possible between myself and the house that had become a prison, a breeding ground for terror. The whispers still echoed in my mind, a cacophony of dread that refused to fade. Join us, join us. With every step I took, I could feel the presence of the rake creeping closer, an unrelenting shadow that mirrored my every move. I didn't know where I was going. My instincts were my only guide, pushing me deeper into the night, into the unknown. I sprinted past the familiar streetlights, their flickering glow now distorted and sinister, casting eerie shapes that danced along the pavement. I stumbled onto a path that led into the nearby woods, the trees looming overhead like sentinels guarding secrets best left undiscovered. The air was thick and heavy, and the shadows deepened as I ventured further into the darkness. I could hear the sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the hooting of an owl, but they felt alien, as if the very night conspired against me. As I navigated through the underbrush, I tripped over roots and fallen branches, my heart racing with every crunch beneath my feet. The whispers grew louder, now merging with the rustling of the trees, blurring the line between reality and my own spiraling madness. I could sense the rake pursuing me, always just out of sight, a grotesque hunter reveling in my fear. I suddenly stumbled into a clearing, moonlight spilling onto the ground like a spotlight, illuminating the space around me. My breath hitched as I turned, half expecting the creature to emerge from the shadows. The clearing felt wrong, too quiet, too still. It was as if time had stopped, holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Then I saw it. The rake stood at the edge of the trees, its thin, emaciated body framed by the darkness. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and it stared at me with those empty eyes, an abyss that threatened to swallow me whole. My instincts screamed for me to run, but something held me in place, a dreadful curiosity mixed with terror. "Why are you doing this?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling as I confronted the creature that haunted my nightmares. It took a step forward, its movements fluid and predatory, and I felt a cold wave of despair wash over me. "Join us," it hissed, the voice a chilling whisper that reverberated through the air, wrapping around me like a noose. I felt my resolve begin to crumble, the pull of the darkness beckoning me. It offered a release from the pain, an escape from the terror that had consumed my life. But then I thought of my parents, of the life I had before this nightmare began. I couldn't let it win. Summoning every ounce of courage I had left, I shouted, "No! I won't let you take me!" My voice rang out, firm and defiant, and I felt a surge of power in my words. The rake halted, confusion flickering across its grotesque features. It took a step back, its body tensing as if my rejection had struck it. I seized the moment and ran, racing toward the edge of the clearing. I could hear its frustrated screech behind me, a sound that echoed through the trees, reverberating in the depths of my mind. As I broke through the tree line and stumbled onto the road, I could see the flickering lights of houses in the distance, the safety of civilization just a few hundred yards away. I didn't stop. I ran faster, adrenaline coursing through my veins as I pushed myself beyond my limits. I could hear the rake behind me, its breath ragged and angry, but I refused to look back. I focused on the lights, on the hope they represented. I was nearly there, almost free, when I heard it, a spine-chilling shriek that pierced the night. It was a cry of rage, of desperation, and it echoed in my soul. I burst into the safety of the nearest house, slamming the door behind me and locking it tight. I leaned against it, gasping for breath, the silence deafening around me. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. The rake was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its chance. I could feel its presence lingering, an ever-watchful specter that had marked me as its own. As I stood there, trembling, I realized that I would never truly be free from the horror that had invaded my life. The rake was a part of me now, a constant reminder of the darkness that existed just beyond the veil of reality. And no matter where I went, or how far I ran, I would always carry its whispers in my mind. The nightmare had begun, and I knew that it would never truly end.
The Legend of Slender Man.
I remember the summer nights of my childhood, the air thick with the scent of pine and the promise of adventure. My friends and I would gather at the edge of the woods, a place that was both familiar and frightening. It was there, beneath the whispering trees, that we spun tales of horror, stories designed to send chills down our spines and make us laugh nervously as we huddled closer together. The legend of Slender Man was the crown jewel of our storytelling sessions. I could still hear the hushed voices as they described him, a tall, skeletal figure, devoid of a face, with long, unnatural limbs that seemed to stretch out like shadows. He was said to lurk in the woods, preying on children, snatching them away when they least expected it. I always felt a knot of unease in my stomach whenever we spoke his name, but I never admitted it. Instead, I laughed along with my friends, trying to mask the fear that clawed at my insides. One particular night, emboldened by the thrill of our tales, we dared each other to venture deeper into the woods. I was reluctant at first, the stories echoing in my mind, but the bravado of my friends pulled me in. Armed with flashlights and a sense of invincibility, we stepped into the darkness, the trees closing in around us. The air felt charged, as if the very woods were alive, holding its breath, waiting for us to make a mistake. As we moved deeper, the laughter faded into nervous whispers, the shadows seeming to stretch and shift with every flick of our flashlights. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see Slender Man's towering figure watching us from the shadows. But nothing prepared me for what happened next. It was as we reached a small clearing, bathed in the eerie glow of the moonlight, that I first caught sight of him. There, just beyond the edge of the trees, stood a tall figure. My heart stopped. It was slender and impossibly tall, its limbs elongated and twisted. There was no face, just a void where features should have been. My breath hitched in my throat as I pointed it out to my friends, but when they turned to look, it was gone. "Just a trick of the light," they said, their voices shaky but dismissive. I tried to convince myself of that too, but deep down, I knew what I had seen was real. That night, I returned home shaken, every noise in the house amplifying my fear. My parents noticed my unease, but they brushed it off as typical teenage drama. I couldn't sleep, the image of Slender Man haunting my thoughts. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, a mere figment brought on by our late-night stories. But then, strange things began to happen. I started hearing whispers, faint yet unmistakable, calling my name from the darkness. I would sit up in bed, heart racing, straining to hear the words. It felt like they were coming from the shadows themselves, taunting me. I felt a heavy weight of dread settle on my chest, as if something sinister was lurking just out of sight. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it clung to me like a dark cloud. And as the days passed, I became more convinced that I was being watched. I caught glimpses of movement in the corner of my eye, shadows flickering just beyond the reach of my vision. My friends seemed distant, lost in their own worlds, and I felt more isolated than ever. Then one night, everything changed. I woke up to the sound of my window creaking open. A cold breeze brushed against my skin, sending shivers down my spine. As I turned to look outside, my heart dropped. There, just beyond the tree line, stood the figure once more. Tall and slender, its arms hanging unnaturally at its sides, it watched me. My breath hitched, and for a moment, I couldn't move. I was frozen in fear, locked in a gaze with a creature straight out of my nightmares. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but the words wouldn't come. I was trapped in that moment, paralyzed by terror, and the realization washed over me, Slender Man was real. As the figure melted back into the shadows, I could only wonder what it wanted from me, and if I was next. The days that followed were a blur of anxiety and dread. I could hardly concentrate at school, my mind always drifting back to that night in the woods. Each creak of the floorboards in my house, each rustle of leaves outside my window, sent my heart racing. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, that Slender Man was just a story, but every night brought new terrors. I began to hear the whispers again. At first, they were faint, almost like a breeze rustling through the leaves. But as the nights wore on, they grew clearer. It was my name, softly spoken, luring me into the darkness. I would lie in bed, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to scream, to wake my parents, but something kept me silent. I was terrified of what I might reveal, the fears that were consuming me. Just the wind, I told myself, clutching my blanket tightly as I closed my eyes. But I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in around me, as if it were alive, watching, waiting. The longer I lay there, the more my imagination twisted those whispers into something sinister. One particularly restless night, I finally mustered the courage to get up and check the window. My heart raced as I crept down the hallway, each step echoing in the stillness of the house. I peeked through the curtain, expecting to see nothing but the familiar shadows of our backyard. But to my horror, the trees seemed to shift, almost as if they were leaning closer, straining to see what was happening inside. I slammed the curtain shut, my breath coming in quick gasps. I was losing my mind. I convinced myself that I just needed to sleep, that everything would feel better in the morning. But as soon as my head hit the pillow, the whispers returned, now more insistent, almost pleading. I couldn't tell if they were trying to comfort me or lure me out. As the nights dragged on, I noticed something else. My friends were acting strange. They seemed distant, their laughter echoing in my ears like fading memories. Whenever I tried to bring up the Slender Man, they brushed it off with nervous chuckles, as if we were kids playing make-believe. But I saw the flicker of fear in their eyes. I was certain they had felt his presence too, even if they wouldn't admit it. One afternoon at school, I overheard two of my friends whispering in the hallway, their eyes darting around as if they were afraid someone was listening. I approached them, heart pounding, and asked what they were talking about. "Just a stupid game," one of them replied, avoiding my gaze. "We're thinking of doing a Slender Man summoning. You know, for fun." My stomach twisted in knots. "Are you serious? You can't just summon him. It's dangerous." They laughed, but it sounded hollow. "Come on, it's just a joke. You're taking this too seriously." But as they walked away, I felt a knot of unease settle deep within me. I knew the danger was real, and the more they brushed it aside, the more I felt the weight of the darkness pressing in around us. The whispers grew louder, more desperate, and I felt a surge of panic rising within me. That night, I decided to confide in my best friend, Jenna. We had been inseparable since childhood, and I hoped she would understand my fears. As we sat in my room, I poured my heart out to her, recounting the encounters and the whispers that plagued my nights. "Jenna, I swear something is out there," I said, my voice trembling. "I saw him. He's real. I feel like he's watching me." Jenna's eyes widened, but then she shook her head with a smile that felt forced. "You're just scared. It's not real. We're older now. We can't let silly stories get to us." But I could see the doubt flicker across her face, and it made my heart sink. We had shared so many late-night talks about monsters and myths, but now, when I needed her belief the most, She was brushing me off. The following night, they went ahead with the summoning. I felt sick, knowing they were playing with forces they couldn't comprehend. I lay awake in bed, my heart racing as I listened to the rustle of the trees outside. I imagined them standing in a circle, chanting silly phrases, unaware of the danger they were inviting into our lives. But then, I heard something different. The whispers that had tormented me for weeks were now a cacophony of voices, rising and falling like a chilling melody. They weren't just calling my name anymore, they were beckoning me to join them. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. I wanted to run, to scream, to make it all stop. But as the night wore on, I could hear my friends' laughter mixed with something darker, something primal that sent shivers down my spine. The last thing I remember was a loud crash from the woods, and then a silence so deep it felt suffocating. I bolted upright in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. The whispers were gone, replaced by an ominous stillness that enveloped my room. I peered out the window, but it was too dark to see anything. All I knew was that something terrible had happened. And as I lay there, wide awake and trembling, I realized I was not alone. Something was out there, and it was waiting for me. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with thoughts of my friends and the chaos they had invited into our lives. The ominous stillness hung in the air like a heavy fog, suffocating and oppressive. I kept replaying the sounds I had heard, the laughter, the whispers, and that loud crash that shattered the night. It felt like a warning, a prelude to something dreadful. When the first light of dawn broke through my window, I jumped out of bed and hurried to my phone. I needed to know what had happened. I texted Jenna and the others, frantically waiting for a response. My heart sank as minutes turned into hours with no replies. I tried to push the nagging feeling of dread away, but it clung to me like a shadow. By midday, the anxiety became unbearable. I had to find them. I decided to head to the clearing where they had performed the summoning the night before, hoping they were just having fun and would be back soon. The familiar path through the woods felt different this time. Every rustle, every snap of a twig made me jump, as if the forest itself was warning me to turn back. As I neared the clearing, I felt a chill creep down my spine. The sun was high in the sky, but the woods felt darker, the trees casting long, sinister shadows. I hesitated at the edge, peering into the clearing, my heart racing with a mix of hope and fear. What I saw sent chills racing through me. The clearing was empty, but there were signs of a struggle. Broken branches, trampled grass, and something that looked like a torn piece of clothing hanging from a bush. Panic surged in my chest. "Jenna!" I shouted, my voice echoing in the silence. "Can you hear me?" Only silence answered back. I stepped further into the clearing, my pulse pounding in my ears. I crouched down, examining the ground for any sign of my friends. It felt wrong, like I was trespassing into a forbidden place. And then I saw it, a strange symbol etched into the dirt, the lines twisted and unnatural. I recognized it from the internet, a symbol linked to Slender Man folklore. My stomach dropped as I took a step back. My breath quickened. The whispers returned, now louder and more frantic, swirling around me like a malevolent wind. I turned to run, but something made me stop. From the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement, a tall, slender figure just beyond the trees. I froze, my blood running cold. "Get away from me!" I screamed, but my voice trembled as I stumbled backward, tripping over a root and falling hard to the ground. My flashlight rolled away, its beam flickering against the trees, casting long, jagged shadows. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing, and took off in the opposite direction, fear driving me deeper into the woods. Branches whipped against my face as I pushed through the underbrush, panic fueling my speed. I had to get home. I had to warn my family. They wouldn't believe me, but I couldn't let them be vulnerable to whatever was out there. It felt like I was running for my life, the whispers growing louder, more desperate as if they were trying to catch me, to pull me back. Finally, I burst out of the woods and into my backyard, panting and shaking. I stumbled toward the house, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I banged on the door, nearly shouting as I yelled for my mom. When she finally opened it, her eyes widened with concern. "What happened? You look like you've seen a ghost," she exclaimed, ushering me inside. "Mom, you have to listen to me. There's something in the woods. Slender Man is real, and he's coming for me. I think Jenna and the others are in trouble." I blurted out, breathless. My mom furrowed her brow, concern etched on her face. "Honey, it's just a story. You're letting your imagination get the best of you. Just calm down." But I couldn't calm down. I rushed to the living room, grabbing my phone again to call Jenna. My hands trembled as I dialed her number, my heart pounding with each ring. The line clicked, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried again and again, but the result was the same. I felt a pit of despair opening in my stomach. "Mom, they're not answering," I shouted, desperation creeping into my voice. "Maybe they're just busy, sweetie. They'll come back soon," she replied, but I could see the worry in her eyes. As night fell, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled over me. The whispers transformed into screams, echoing in my mind, a cacophony of panic that left me on edge. I sat in my room, every creak of the house amplifying my anxiety, jumping at the shadows that danced in the corners. Then, the power went out. The darkness swallowed the room, and I was plunged into an abyss of uncertainty. I fumbled for my flashlight, flicking it on and illuminating the walls, but the light felt weak against the encroaching darkness. And then I heard it, a soft tapping sound, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from my window. My heart stopped. I stood frozen, the flashlight beam trembling in my grip. The tapping grew louder, insistent, and I felt an icy chill creep down my spine. "Jenna," I called, my voice barely a whisper. But deep down, I knew it wasn't her. I edged closer to the window, my mind racing with terrifying possibilities. I had to know what was outside. As I pulled the curtain back, I peered into the darkness, and there, just beyond the glass, stood the tall, slender figure once again. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, its presence suffocating. I stumbled backward, fear flooding my senses, and I heard the whispers, my name, repeated over and over, drowning out my thoughts. Suddenly, I realized what I had to do. I couldn't wait for my friends to come back. I had to confront whatever was happening, and I had to do it now. I took a deep breath, summoning all my courage, knowing that there was no turning back. The air felt heavy as I steadied myself, my heart pounding like a war drum in my chest. The slender figure loomed outside my window, its featureless face a void that swallowed the weak light from my flashlight. I fought the urge to run, forcing myself to breathe deeply. I had to confront this nightmare. I had to understand what was happening to my friends and why this creature had come for me. I grabbed my phone, its dim screen flickering with the last remnants of battery life. I quickly opened my messages, hoping for any sign of Jenna or the others. But the screen was empty. No new messages, no missed calls. I felt a wave of despair wash over me, but I pushed it away. I couldn't give in to hopelessness now. Taking a deep breath, I opened my bedroom door and crept down the dark hallway, each step echoing in the silence. I glanced back at the window, half expecting to see the figure vanish. But it stood there, motionless, as if waiting for me to make the next move. I made my way to the living room, where the faint light from the street lamps filtered through the curtains. I searched for anything I could use as a weapon: kitchen knives, a baseball bat, something that would give me a fighting chance. But my thoughts were a jumbled mess, and I could hardly think straight. Then, I remembered the stories I'd read online about Slender Man. They spoke of rituals and protections, ways to ward him off. I needed to gather whatever I could find. I rummaged through the kitchen drawers and found a handful of salt. I recalled that salt was said to be protective against evil entities. It wasn't much, but it was something. I poured the salt into a small pile on the floor in front of the door, creating a makeshift barrier. As I did, the tapping from my window grew more aggressive, each sound a reminder of the urgency of the situation. I felt a knot of fear tightening in my stomach, but knew that I had to stand my ground. "Come on, Jenna. Where are you?" I whispered to myself, my voice trembling as I anxiously awaited a response that never came. I looked outside again, and to my horror, the figure had moved closer, now standing at the edge of my yard, obscured by the darkness of the trees. Its long arms hung limply at its sides, and I could feel its gaze piercing through the glass. I felt exposed and vulnerable, the weight of its presence pressing down on me. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, illuminating the room in a stark, blinding light. I took a moment to blink away the shock, but the relief was short-lived. The tapping had stopped. The silence was deafening, but I felt it in my bones. A storm was brewing just outside. I heard a faint whisper, an echo that slithered into my ears like a chilling breeze. "Join us," it beckoned, haunting and ethereal. My breath caught in my throat. I knew that voice. It was Jenna's. "Jenna!" I shouted, panic clawing at my chest. "Where are you? What happened?" The whispering intensified, growing louder, filling the room with a cacophony of chilling voices, all pleading and calling my name. I clamped my hands over my ears, trying to block them out, but it felt like they were inside my head. I had to break free from this torment. In a moment of clarity, I remembered the symbol I had seen in the clearing, the twisted lines that had marked the ground. I could use that knowledge. I needed to take the fight to him, to confront whatever was happening in those woods. Maybe if I faced him, I could save Jenna and the others. With renewed determination, I grabbed my flashlight, the small beam of light my only ally against the looming darkness. I made my way back to the front door, the salt still glimmering on the floor. I hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the flickering shadows dancing on the walls, the whispers growing ever more frantic. But I couldn't let fear hold me back any longer. I stepped outside into the cool night air, the world around me feeling surreal and distorted. I looked toward the woods, the silhouette of the trees looming ominously in the distance. There was no turning back. "Slender Man!" I yelled, my voice trembling but filled with defiance. "I'm not afraid of you. Show yourself." The wind howled, and for a moment there was silence. Then the figure emerged from the shadows, tall and imposing. Its elongated limbs twisted unnaturally, and I could feel the air grow colder around me. I gripped my flashlight tighter, ready to confront the horror that had haunted my life for too long. "What do you want?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Where are my friends?" The figure took a step closer, and I felt a pull, as if it were drawing me in. The whispers swelled, filling my mind with promises of power and darkness. "Join us," it repeated, the sound wrapping around me like a sinister embrace. I fought against the compulsion, focusing on my friends. "No, you can't have them. They're not yours," I screamed, the words bursting from me like a shield against the encroaching darkness. As I stood my ground, the whispers turned to shrieks, the figure recoiling slightly as if it had been struck. I felt a surge of energy flow through me, a rush of strength fueled by desperation and fear. I needed to break the hold it had on my friends, to pull them back from whatever abyss they had fallen into. With every ounce of courage, I took a step toward the figure, brandishing my flashlight like a weapon. "You'll never take them. I won't let you." The figure let out a low growl, the ground trembling beneath my feet. I felt the darkness surge around me, and in that moment, I knew I had to confront it, not just for myself, but for Jenna and the others. It was a battle of wills, and I was determined to win. And just as I took another step forward, ready to fight, the ground beneath me began to shift. The world faded away, and I was plunged into darkness, swallowed whole by the very terror I sought to confront. I was engulfed by an oppressive darkness, the kind that made my skin crawl and my heart race. It wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket, pulling me deeper into a void where time and space lost all meaning. I struggled to breathe, gasping for air in the thick silence. It was as if the world had collapsed, leaving me in a nightmare with no escape. "Jenna, can you hear me?" I shouted into the void, my voice swallowed by the darkness. My thoughts raced, frantically trying to piece together what was happening. I could feel the presence of Slender Man lurking nearby, his essence brushing against me like a chilling wind. As I floated in the dark, disoriented, I felt something shift in the atmosphere, a distant whisper. It sounded like a cry, a plea for help that sent chills down my spine. "Jenna!" I called out again, this time louder, desperation clawing at my throat. "Where are you?" The darkness flickered, and suddenly, a scene began to materialize before my eyes. It was a glimpse of the woods, the clearing where we had first summoned Slender Man. I could see the twisted trees and the eerie glow of the moonlight filtering through the branches. But it was different now, darker, as if a storm was brewing just out of sight. "Please!" I yelled, pushing through the suffocating darkness. "Show me! Show me where you are!" With a jolt, I found myself standing in the clearing, the air electric with tension. My heart raced as I looked around, scanning for any sign of Jenna or the others. The woods were alive with whispers, echoing my fears and doubts. I could feel the weight of Slender Man's presence, looming in the shadows, watching. "Jenna, if you can hear me, make a sound," I commanded, my voice trembling with urgency. But there was nothing, just the rustle of leaves and the distant call of night creatures. Then, from the corner of my eye, I caught a flicker of movement. I turned, hope igniting in my chest. It was a figure, small and hunched over, crouched in the underbrush. My heart soared. "Jenna!" I rushed toward it, my breath catching in my throat as I got closer. But as I approached, the figure turned, and I felt my stomach drop. It wasn't Jenna. It was a child, pale and wide-eyed, staring at me with a look of pure terror. I realized then that it was not just a child. It was one of the missing kids, a face I recognized from the news reports. My blood ran cold. "Help me," the child whispered, their voice barely audible above the rustling leaves. "He's coming. Where's Jenna? Where are the others?" I demanded, panic rising within me. "We need to get out of here." The child pointed toward the center of the clearing, trembling as if they could feel the darkness closing in. "He's taking them. You have to hurry." I felt a surge of anger and determination. "I won't let him take anyone else," I shouted, steeling myself for whatever I would face. "Stay here. I'll find them." I ran toward the center of the clearing, my pulse racing. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a tempest. "Join us! Join us!" they chanted, each voice echoing with the desperation of those lost to Slender Man's grasp. As I reached the center, the air thickened with dread. The moonlight struggled to penetrate the darkness, and I felt the weight of Slender Man's presence more than ever. His form loomed behind me, impossibly tall, his tentacle-like limbs stretching out into the shadows. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted, facing the horror. "What do you want from us?" For a moment, there was silence. Then, the whispers morphed into a single voice, deep and resonant. "You cannot escape your fate. Join us, and you will know power beyond your imagination." I clenched my fists, defiance igniting within me. "I will never join you. I'm not afraid of you." I felt the heat of anger rise within me, fueling my resolve. "Let my friends go." In response, Slender Man's limbs twisted unnaturally, reaching out as if to ensnare me. But I stood my ground, recalling the salt, the protective barrier I had made. I began to spread it around me, creating a circle, whispering words of strength and defiance. "Stay back," I cried, the salt shimmering in the dim light. The air crackled with energy, and Slender Man recoiled, his figure flickering in and out of focus. "You have no power here." The whispers turned to howls, the cries of lost souls echoing through the clearing as Slender Man thrashed in anger. I felt the darkness retreat slightly, the pressure around me loosening. "Jenna!" I called, desperation clawing at my throat. "I'm coming for you." Suddenly, the ground beneath me trembled, and I saw a flash of movement from the shadows. My heart raced as I spotted Jenna, standing at the edge of the clearing, her face pale but alive. Relief washed over me, and I rushed toward her. "Jenna, you're okay." I pulled her into a tight embrace, the warmth of her presence grounding me amid the chaos. "We need to get out of here." But just as we turned to flee, Slender Man loomed before us, his form growing larger and more menacing. "You cannot leave," he hissed, his voice a sinister whisper that sent chills down my spine. I held Jenna close, feeling her tremble against me. "We won't let you take her," I shouted, my voice rising above the cacophony of whispers. "You're nothing but a shadow. You have no power over us." In that moment, the darkness shifted, revealing the faces of those lost to Slender Man, their eyes filled with a desperate longing for freedom. I could feel their pain and fear, and it fueled my anger. "We're stronger than you think," I declared, stepping forward with Jenna beside me. Together, we faced the darkness, and as we did, the ground beneath us began to crack. The whispers morphed into screams, rising in pitch as the dark figure thrashed, trying to maintain its hold on us. With a final surge of determination, I shouted, "You have no place here." And in that moment, I felt the energy of everyone who had suffered at Slender Man's hands surge through me. "Go back to where you belong," I yelled, and with that, the darkness shattered around us, the clearing exploding into brilliant light. The screams faded into silence, and I felt a rush of wind sweep us off our feet. As the light enveloped us, I held Jenna tighter, knowing that we were breaking free from the nightmare. When the light dimmed, I found myself back in my bedroom, gasping for breath, the weight of terror lifting from my chest. Jenna stood beside me, looking just as bewildered. "We made it," she whispered, disbelief flooding her voice. "We did," I breathed, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. Slender Man was still out there, lurking in the shadows, but for now, we were safe. And as I looked around my room, I realized that the legend of Slender Man would never truly be gone. It would live on in the whispers of the woods, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to wander too close. But now, I had the strength to fight back, to warn others, and to ensure that Jenna and I would never be lost to the darkness again.